And my nomination for my Black hero for Black History Month is Marcus Mosiah Garvey. Marcus Garvey was born in Jamaica in 1887 and died in London in 1940. And the reason why I've chosen him is because he's now largely forgotten, but at the time, in terms of the 1920s in Harlem in America, he led what I think is today still the largest Black liberation movement the world has ever seen, much larger than the later movement in terms of led by Martin Luther King in terms of civil rights. So Marcus Garvey really was born in Jamaica, but travelled to America in the early part of the 20th century, and obviously would have met a great deal of racism that was the norm in terms of what was happening in America at the time in terms of the treatment of people of African descent. And Garvey was inspired really to try and challenge that. And so what he did was to create a movement that had a number of strands. Its most important strand was this sense of Black pride, helping people of African descent to feel proud of their African heritage at the time where many people in America and in other parts of the diaspora would have seen Africa as a place it was depicted in very backward terms. One thinks of the Tarzan films and the notion of Africans as primitive. And so a lot of Africans would have, well, people in the diaspora would have run away from any identification with Africa. And so Marcus Garvey really was one of those who really started this pride for people of African descent to be proud of Africa. He was the one who helped us to think about ourselves as coming from a lineage of kings and queens, and so long before Europeans came into Africa. And African history often started with slavery. He said, actually, if you go back into history, we had great kingdoms, and at a time when Europeans were backward, Africans had great civilizations. And so he was very much really of his time in terms of leading people of African descent, particularly in North America, but actually around the world. There were chapters of Garvey's movement, which was called like the Universal Negro Improvement Association. And he had these chapters all over the world, and he was a huge following. He, of course, was disliked by the white authorities in America, and they found a trumped-up charge, and eventually he was imprisoned, and then following in prison, he was deported because he was not an American citizen, so deported to Jamaica, ended up living in exile in London, in fairly impoverished situations, and died, I believe, of a massive heart attack in 1940 during the onset of World War II. As I said, he's largely forgotten now, except for people who are very much if you're into Black history and studying Black culture, then you'll know who Marcus Garvey is, but most people don't know who he is now. I think we're impoverished by not knowing about him, because what he does is that if you want to understand Black Lives Matter, long before this phrase came into vogue, then you need to understand about Marcus Garvey. That essentially he was talking about Black Lives Matter long before it turned into a movement and a catchphrase and people taking the knee. That's not to dispute or to disparage any of that now, but it's to say that if we know our history, this isn't new. It very much starts really with Marcus Garvey, who led, I believe, and people still assert, the largest movement the world has ever seen.